right, excellent. Well, thank you for that. Um, that wonderful introduction. I've been looking forward to this opportunity for quite a while now. I see a wonderful gathering in the list of attendees, and so if you have questions or comments, like Mike said, feel free to stick them in the chat. I'll try to get to them after I'm done speaking to you tonight. Um, I am Zachary Fry. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Military History at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College. And I'm going to be talking to you tonight about the subject of my book, A Republic in the Ranks, Loyalty and Dissent in the Army of the Potomac. It's been a busy week or two. I've been doing a lot of teaching, and that bane of any educator's existence, a lot of grading. So as I mentioned, I've been looking forward to this for a while. I think we can all agree that the one thing we desperately need more of in our lives right now is partisan politics. So on a completely unrelated note to that, I want to stress that these are my views on history alone and not necessarily those of the Department of Defense or the United States Army. I'll go ahead and switch slides here. Among the best fighting units of the Union Army, and I feel safe saying that with Dr. Jim Pula in the audience. This isn't pandering to the 11th Corps lovers in the audience. Among the best units in the Army of the Potomac was German-born Captain Hubert Dilger's Battery I, 1st Ohio Light Artillery. By the late summer of 1863, the men of Dilger's battery had fought desperately, trying to stall Stonewall Jackson's flank attack at Chancellorsville on May 2nd, and suffering through another harrowing debacle on July 1st, 1863, at Gettysburg. And in both instances, they had performed brilliantly with their 12-pound Napoleons. On August 27th, 1863, Dilger and the men of his battery publicly expressed a desire to turn their canister fire on Northern civilians at home. Resolved, they declared, that no duty would be more acceptable to us than that of punishing these cowardly enemies in our rear. But as this privilege is denied to us, we demand as part fulfillment of the promise of sympathy and succor made to us by the homestayers, that these traitors be summarily quenched and our attention left undivided to their brethren in front. Harsh words. In fact, Dilger's battery was only one of dozens and dozens of Army of the Potomac units to threaten their fellow countrymen this way over the course of 1863. What could possibly have caused such a frightening response from the Army? What could have motivated such words? The answer, of course, is politics. And that's the story that I'll be sharing with you this evening. Political divides were evident not just between the Army and the home front, but within the Army of the Potomac as well. And I'll highlight two examples right up front here. The gentleman you see on the left is Colonel James Clay Rice, commander of the 44th New York State Volunteers. Rice had not yet led his regiment to glory on a hill called Little Round Top as part of Strong Vincent's brigade at Gettysburg when he wrote these words that you see. He was an unapologetic supporter of President Abraham Lincoln and of Republican policies. And in February of 1863, he had actually taken the extraordinary step of writing directly to President Lincoln to express his and the Army's, he said, support for the newly implemented Emancipation Proclamation. God's object in this war is the destruction of slavery, Rice wrote. You, he said to Lincoln, are the honored instrument in accomplishing his purposes. He rules the hearts of this army. He rules the hearts of the people. Lead on as you have led. The army will sustain you. The people will follow, and God will guide you. That was James Rice to Abraham Lincoln on February 8th, 1863. Another Union brigade commander who had helped secure Little Round Top at Gettysburg was Colonel William Buck McCandless, as he was known. And unlike Rice, McCandless was a defiant Democrat, a man who despised the president's policies and what the anti-slavery forces, he thought, had done to the Northern war effort. He left the Army of the Potomac in the summer of 1864 and sent a message to the Secretary of War making his perspective perfectly clear on the matters. When those who administer this government readopt the original intention, McCandless said, of prosecuting this war for the restoration of the Union, I, together with hundreds of officers and thousands of men at present out of service, will be found ready and willing to return. The mid-19th century political process in the United States was raucous. It was corrupt. It was intensely partisan. And the officers and men of the Union Army capitalized on that process. They used newspapers and voting to set the terms of debate about politics in the North. They published opinion pieces relentlessly, arguing policy with those at home and in the public eye with others in their own units. And then the Army voted overwhelmingly in 1864 for Lincoln. What makes this all so compelling, I think, and so captivating is that the Army of the Potomac itself was George McClellan's army for so much of the war. And as I'm sure you all know, McClellan was Lincoln's opponent in the 1864 election. So this story of politics in the Army, I think, is the story of politically aware young men having to navigate the channels of loyalty and dissent. Republicans in the ranks answering to a Democratic high command at Army headquarters, and Democrats at Army headquarters answering to a Republican administration in Washington. The basic differences in the big political issues of the day were these. Republicans were a fairly new party, wildly successful in 1860 after fears of a slave power gripped Northern voters. Republicans didn't really see this impermeable line between the military and the political process. They thought soldiers should actively participate in defining what political loyalty should mean in a time of rebellion, of domestic insurrection. They viewed soldiers as the guardians of civic virtue during the war. Democrats, taking a slightly different tack, often asserted devotion to the Constitution, or at least their view of it, as the highest moral end. They hated, or professed to hate, political interference in the military. They viewed war as the result of fanaticism in both the North and the South, and they were also focused on questions of civil liberties. Democrats made significant headway in the midterm elections in the fall of 1862 and used this momentum to attack Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation, as well as the March 1863 implementation of a national draft. And the most strident Democrats, as I'm sure you all know, were known as the Copperheads, politicians like Clement Vallandigham from Ohio, whose views, at least in the eyes of the Army, amounted to treason. Now, the McClellan legacy casts a long shadow over the story of the Army of the Potomac, and much of the debate over the war's political questions used Little Mac as a proxy for bigger issues. McClellan himself, of course, was deeply political and relentlessly ambitious. Now, I won't go through the whole history of the Army and McClellan's role in it. So instead, I'd like to highlight a few key moments in the political story of the Army of the Potomac. And that's essentially how I organized my book. Each chapter paying attention to a particular period in the Army's history when politics dominated the discussion. The war had not gone well for Union forces in the East for much of 1862. with the young Army of the Potomac trounced outside Richmond and chased back to the gates of Washington by the end of the summer. And after McClellan failed to bring Lee to decisive engagement following the bloodbath at Antietam, Lincoln, perhaps reluctantly, fired him. It was a moment of grave political importance for the American Republic after Antietam because the nation's Republican leader was firing one of the most dynamic and popular Democrats in the United States. And one friend of McClellan's, an irascible general named Andrew Humphreys, shouted during McClellan's farewell review that the Army should just turn around, march on Washington, and throw the Republicans themselves into the Potomac. If you read soldiers' letters home in the autumn of 1862, you can practically see the tears falling down their faces when they talk about losing McClellan. Now, speaking of soldiers' letters, one of the real problems I think historians have encountered when studying the Army of the Potomac, and especially soldiers' attitudes about the war, is that we've all basically been examining the same catalog of a few hundred primary sources. We've all been looking at the same published diaries and letter collections. We've all been reading the same letter collections from archives. And so what I tried to do with this project was expand the source base. My book utilizes three main types of largely untapped sources. First, soldier voting returns. For much of the Civil War, Union soldiers weren't allowed to vote at the front because of state constitutional technicalities. And I know that sounds weird to us in retrospect, that soldiers of all people wouldn't be allowed to vote, wouldn't be allowed to exercise their civic duty. But states insisted, especially those where Democrats held the state house or the legislature, that state constitutions technically forbade members or residents of the state from voting if they had been away from the state for more than 6 months. And so soldiers at the front were simply out of luck. But eventually that started to change. And it really started to change, as you might expect, ahead of the 1864 election. So I managed to track down voting tabulations for individual regiments in most of the key races and from most of the key states, especially in 1864. Second type of source that I looked at was letters that soldiers wrote to newspapers at home. Newspapers have been increasingly digitized over the past decade, many of them keyword searchable. And although that's not the entirety of my research into newspapers, I did spend plenty of time in front of the microfilm. Men at the front knew, I think, that the best way to influence opinion at home was to publish. And the partisan newspapers of the day simply ate that material up. And I think some of the most underused and undervalued sources of all are in state archives and libraries, places like Albany and Harrisburg and Columbus, which house all of the letters between the Army's junior and field grade officers at the front and state governors back home, who actually awarded the commissions. These letters are overflowing with political conversation. Lieutenants and captains are complaining about the politics of their colonels. Enlisted men are writing to complain about the politics of their lieutenants and captains. So politics was central to all of the correspondence between the front line and the politicians back home. The officers tended to be the more politically active men in the Army. On the whole, officers, and I'm speaking here of junior and field grade, but I'll focus mostly on junior officers over the course of this. They were slightly older than the men under their command, oftentimes, slightly better educated, according to the demographic records that we have. And they often came into the army with their political views mostly settled. They thought they knew the world, they understood the way things worked. And whether it was because soldiers loved them, um, learned to despise them, or maybe somewhere in between, the officers' opinions and political actions carried a lot of weight. So the main characters, I think, in the political tale of the Army of the Potomac are actually this subordinate officer class who led the companies and regiments into battle. The numerous setbacks in 1862, coupled with the relatively unpopular emancipation policy, gave Democrats something of a tailwind in the midterm elections, as I mentioned a couple minutes ago. Some of the more brazen anti-war Democrats, the Copperheads, secured influence in the legislatures of states like Illinois and Indiana and New Jersey, especially. And as soon as Copperheads made headway in several states throughout the North, Union soldiers started raising their voices against them. And it all started in late February 1863 when officers in the 11th Corps gathered to draft resolutions of protest against the Democratic Party. And shortly thereafter, soldiers from Illinois, Indiana, and New Jersey regiments drafted resolutions denouncing their own state legislatures. And this political fire eventually spread to every corner of the Army of the Potomac, usually with officers writing the documents and then reading them to the soldiers on parade. So in March and April of 1863 especially, these sorts of ceremonies were common in the camps of the Army of the Potomac in places like Stafford County, Virginia. The resolutions talked openly about challenging Copperheads and traitors at home. They called on family members and friends to shun the Democrats. And they frequently said they had more respect for Confederate soldiers than they did for anti-war protesters back north. As the first Delaware put it, Copperheads, and I like this mid-19th century euphemism, they were destitute of the essential elements of manhood. Make of that what you will. Officers would draft the documents together at regimental headquarters usually, and then brought the regiments up on parade to hear the resolutions read aloud. And they would then ask if anybody in the ranks disagreed with the sentiments. And I think this was a way of announcing what political loyalty would mean going forward in the Army, challenging Democrats in the ranks to make their voices heard. And here are just a few choice quotations from these resolutions. "We can no longer keep silent," the officers of the 44th New York declared. They felt called to proclaim what true loyalty was and refute that there was any hint of dissatisfaction in the ranks. The soldier in the 14th Connecticut remembered, "The proportion of anti-Lincoln men to the whole army is not greater than that of Judas Iscariot to the other disciples." Many resolutions spoke in religious terms about the war effort. They called it the unholy rebellion. And one, the 149th Pennsylvania Regiment, used phrases like, "We recognize the fearful struggle our country is now engaged in as a struggle of freedom against slavery, right against wrong, of God against Satan." So they vowed practically unconditional obedience to Lincoln's administration and whatever policies Congress saw fit to pass. The Iron Brigade, for instance, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with, the 2nd, 6th, 7th Wisconsin, 19th Indiana, and 24th Michigan, declared that it would uphold Lincoln in all acts or measures having for their object a vigorous prosecution of the war. The 3rd Pennsylvania Reserves was most direct, and this may be my favorite. In denouncing the anti-war protesters at home, it said, "The only right we grant to traitors is the right to die." So here's a complete list of the resolutions I managed to uncover from this spring 1863 period. Historians have known about these for a long time. but typically we were only looking at about 10 to 15 of them that had managed to be located in the newspaper publications of March and April 1863. I managed to find about 60 or 65 just from the Army of the Potomac alone. They represent every corps in the Army camped in central and northern Virginia in the spring of 1863. Now, the next period my book examines is the fall of 1863. After the triumph at Gettysburg, when the Army of the Potomac was busy chasing Lee's army across northern Virginia in September and October 1863, looking for the elusive knockout blow against Lee. It was also a period of intense political debate. And it all started with an episode in the Army's history called the McClellan Testimonial. Now, many of you probably worked in an office where folks circulate a get well card or a birthday card or a retirement card for a coworker or a boss. And that's kind of what the Army of the Potomac did in the fall of 1863 for its old commander, George McClellan. In mid-September 1863, several officers at Army headquarters, Commanding General George Gordon Meade, John Sedgwick, commanding the 6th Corps, George Sykes, commanding the 5th Corps, Henry Hunt, commanding the artillery, and numerous staff officers, decided that it would be a good idea to circulate a request that every officer and soldier in the Army contribute money for a gift to George McClellan. The occasion was simply to show that there were no hard feelings, that the Army still loved McClellan and thought of him fondly. The reason we know so much about all this is because George McClellan had kind of a personal agent working within the Army of the Potomac High Command. His brother, Arthur McClellan, was a staff officer serving with John Sedgwick, and young Arthur wrote his older brother about the whole thing. George Meade, Arthur McClellan said, wanted to keep the testimonial project secret until it was a fait accompli so that the administration and the newspapers didn't lose their minds over it. There on the screen, you see Arthur McClellan on the side looking devious. General Meade pledged to do all he could, Arthur said, to promote the success of the undertaking. The intention was to keep it as secret as possible until all the names were in, as opposition in Washington was expected. The circular that was printed describing all of this can be found in David Bell Birney's papers at the U.S. Army War College. And it asks the generals each to contribute $20 and so on down the chain of command so that each enlisted man would donate something like 10 cents each. Doesn't sound like a whole lot of money when you add it all together, not by 2025 standards at least. But if you adjust for inflation, which is difficult considering the context, but if you adjust for inflation, we're talking about probably a testimonial or a gift on the order of about $2 million today. So that's a big deal. I doubt they did their annual ethics training online that year. All of this was for the purpose, they said, of showing McClellan that the warm feelings which he has ever borne towards this army is fully reciprocated by officers and men. And then they would give to McClellan a book that would catalog the names of every one of his beloved soldiers who had contributed. So the tactics were very similar to what Republican supporting officers had implemented earlier the same year, drafting a document, applying pressure to men under their command to subscribe to it, and in this case, compiling a black and white list of McClellan supporters in the Army of the Potomac. Well, two generals in the Army threw down the gauntlet against the McClellan testimonial. David Bell Birney, whom I just mentioned, commander at that point of the 3rd Corps, and Oliver Otis Howard of the 11th Corps, telling their men that they believed it would be essentially political suicide for the Army to go down this particular path. Now, some of the Army's McClellan supporters were horrified to learn that anyone would dare read politics into the effort. The men of the Army never thought of politics in connection with the thing, wrote a soldier in the 1st Massachusetts Light Artillery. Others were politically aware enough to know that this could be a veritable powder keg. An artillerist in the 6th New York Battery wrote home, "Some soldiers hint that this testimonial, instead of lining General McClellan's pocket, goes into the exchequer of the opposition to overthrow the administration that deposed him." Well, just as they had that spring, individual regiments gathered to voice their opposition. Among these were the 1st Pennsylvania Reserves, the 60th New York in George Sears Green's brigade, and the 119th Pennsylvania of Sedgwick's own 6th Corps. The 60th New York said the whole affair reeked of raw politics, and the 119th Pennsylvania, I found their original manuscript against the McClellan testimonial in Philadelphia, was published verbatim in the Philadelphia Press, where you can see the column there on the right side of the screen. The 119th said, "We consider the movement an ingenious political scheme designed for some other object, and that it's going to be used by political demagogues," they said, "as a weapon for the accomplishment of their unholy purposes." The testimonial showed that McClellanism had become a political liability for the Army of the Potomac. One of Howard's subordinates in the 11th Corps, Major General Carl Schurz, was a frequent correspondent of Abraham Lincoln and Salmon Chase, Secretary of the Treasury. Chase was essentially his political patron in Washington, and Schurz sent a copy of the circular to Chase, who in turn showed it to Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, always known for his measured demeanor. Stanton was characteristically furious when he heard about the testimonial, and he went straight to Lincoln. What's interesting, I think, about this is that within just a couple days of the administration learning of the McClellan testimonial, they summoned Army of the Potomac Commander George Meade to Washington, ostensibly to discuss sending 2 corps out west to help Union General William Rosecrans, who was besieged at Chattanooga. But I have a feeling that wasn't all they talked about, because as soon as he returned to camp, Meade issued a mandate that all the donations for the testimonial be returned, and the effort halted in its tracks. All of this McClellan testimonial stuff might have blown over with little consequence, except that it happened at the height of political campaign season in the North. In states like Maine, Wisconsin, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, key elections featuring Democrats, anti-war Democrats many of the time, and Republicans or their Union Party allies squaring off. And some of the toughest units in the Army of the Potomac gathered for yet more resolutions. The Iron Brigade among them, the 20th Maine among them, and Dilger's Battery, as I mentioned at the beginning of our talk tonight. The men of Joshua Chamberlain's 20th Maine adopted a series of resolutions, told people back home that they had a solemn choice to make shameful or glorious forever the graves of the regiment's Little Round Top casualties. It depended on how they would vote. And the most egregious candidate in the eyes of the Army was Clement Vallandigham. You see him right there, the leader of the Ohio Copperhead movement. Democrats, astonishingly, had nominated him while he was literally in exile because of his political extremism. And as the Ohioans of Dilger's Battery put it, no duty would be more acceptable to us than that of punishing these cowardly traitors in our rear. The partisan fighting was especially fierce in Pennsylvania. Numerous regiments published manifestos in support of Andrew Curtin, the soldier's friend governor of the Keystone State. Curtin's Democratic opponent was George Woodward, the state Supreme Court justice who had written the majority opinion that once denied Pennsylvania soldiers the right to vote at the front, earlier in the war. The reaction in the Army to his nomination by the Democrats was about as enthusiastic as you might imagine. They labeled him a traitor and a copperhead. The most consequential thing wasn't Woodward's defeat. That was hardly surprising to anyone following the election. It was that right before voters headed to the polls, Woodward got an 11th hour boost in the Philadelphia press from none other than George McClellan. Little Mac endorsed Woodward's candidacy. The soldiers were aghast. It was as if Little Mac himself had hoisted the flag of treason. And in the words of some soldiers, he wouldn't have been physically safe visiting the Army that week. One soldier in the 59th New York of the Second Corps wrote home to his sweetheart, "When Lincoln removed McClellan, at first we thought it was quite wrong, for we worshipped him. But since, we have learned better." Yet Democrats felt McClellan was their best choice to seize the soldier vote in the 1864 election, and that's the final event I'll discuss. As you all know, Lincoln carried the clear majority of the soldier vote in that election. In the Army of the Potomac, soldiers from every northern state but two gave Lincoln at least 15 to 20% higher turnout than their state brethren voters back home. Instead of going through all that, I thought I'd highlight an aspect of the 1864 election that's never really been examined before. How the many thousands of soldiers who chose not to re-enlist in 1864 used their status as veterans to influence the vote back home. Because you see, in late 1863, much of the Army of the Potomac, indeed most of it, grappled with the question of whether to re-enlist. And many of those who had fought with the Army at places like Gettysburg were too exhausted to continue. Tens of thousands took their honorable discharge over the course of the next several months. When it came time for the election, Lincoln and the Republicans cast a wide net in their convention. They rebranded themselves the National Union Party and brought in a war Democrat, Andrew Johnson, to serve as vice presidential nominee. Democrats nominated McClellan after a great deal of infighting. And they appeased the anti-war wing of their party by naming a notorious copperhead as their VP, George Pendleton from Ohio. The party's platform called Lincoln's prosecution of the war a failure and basically said Northerners should reach an armistice agreement to restore the Union with the Constitution as it was, meaning, of course, that things like emancipation would be entirely negotiable. McClellan personally struggled to reconcile his natural wish to defeat the Confederacy with his party's wish to strike a bargain, and he never really figured out how to do that. Thousands of veterans, though, men who had until recently been in the ranks of the Army of the Potomac and were carrying scars with them as they reintegrated into daily life, mobilized to support their preferred candidate. It was a real case of Union veterans clashing with each other over politics. Competing political clubs marched in torchlight parades. That was a big deal back then. Held rallies, sponsored speeches, and even fought each other sometimes in the streets. In New York, there was the McClellan Legion. And these were mostly blue blood New York officers who'd been close to Little Mac during their service and wanted to mobilize the soldier vote for him. You can see a couple of their leaders there. Abram Duryea from the 5th New York, Duryea's Zouaves, and John Henry Hobart Ward, who had commanded the brigade in the 3rd Corps before being dismissed later in 1864. Both of them were among the leaders of the McClellan Legion, which met frequently at places like Delmonico's in Manhattan. Other New York officers recently returned from the war formed their own organization called the Veteran Union Club, the VUC, which met at the Cooper Union downtown and worked to mobilize Republican voter turnout in the city. It was a real who's who of anti-McClellan commanders, guys like Daniel Sickles, Daniel Butterfield, Abner Doubleday, the same men who had tormented Meade and other McClellan supporters while they served together in the Army of the Potomac. Other officers from the Army gave their own speeches on Lincoln's behalf at the Union League of Manhattan and elsewhere, including the Cooper Union, men like Joseph Hooker, Ambrose Burnside, and Lysander Cutler. Philadelphia's veterans organizations were probably the most interesting. They included a lot more men at the junior and field grade officer level. New York's veteran organizations were really centered on the general officers, but Philadelphia's were real veterans from the ranks and from the subordinate officer corps. So Philadelphia featured the McClellan Old Guard, led by men like Buck McCandless, a staunch Democrat from the Pennsylvania Reserves, and other officers from the Philadelphia Brigade rounded out the leadership. Charles Kokersberger and Richard Penn Smith of the 71st Pennsylvania, all of them veterans of the Battle of Gettysburg. The Soldiers' Campaign Club, the SCC, was the Republicans' answer to the McClellan Old Guard. More Philadelphia Brigade veterans lined up behind Lincoln, so the Philadelphia Brigade was really split right down the middle. They organized thousands of their city's veterans into battalions and companies that would march in different parts of the city at night to try to intimidate Democrats and rally Republicans. These were veterans who structured their organization using the same familiar methods of command and drill they had learned in the Army of the Potomac. The pro-Lincoln organizations in particular were important because they were really a predecessor to the eventual Grand Army of the Republic that came into existence several years later. And an example of just how insidious the political divide could be was in the ranks of the old 2nd Pennsylvania Reserves, whose veterans were split right down the middle. The regiment's first colonel and several of his subordinates served in the Republican or the Union Party Club, the Soldiers' Campaign Club, while Colonel McCandless and his allies worked for McClellan. And caught in the middle was the regiment's last colonel, who happened to be the unfortunate son of George Woodward, the state's 1863 Democratic candidate for governor. Philadelphia was really the epicenter of all this veteran political activity. And the fact that men like McCandless were encouraging enlisted veterans to enroll in their paramilitary organizations meant that there was always the threat of violence. Democratic and National Union Party organizations conducted a lot of these torchlight parades or processions in the last week of October 1864. Sort of long parades of veterans carrying torches at night, often meant to intimidate the other side, reminiscent of the 1860 wide awakes phenomenon you might have heard of that had swept Republican communities back then. Well, on the evening of October 29th, 1864, a torchlight procession of Democratic veterans descended on the headquarters of the Soldiers' Campaign Club, the Lincoln Group. And standing guard outside the SCC building was a veteran from the 29th Pennsylvania named Francis Fritz, who'd been wounded serving in the 12th Corps of the Army. Words were exchanged, rocks and punches thrown. Democratic soldiers ended up pummeling Fritz to the ground, and he survived just long enough to cast a vote for Lincoln before he returned to his sickbed and died about a week later on November 9th. His death shocked Republican veterans in the community, and many of them donned their Army of the Potomac uniforms to bury him just days after Lincoln's re-election. I'd be remiss not to close with just a glimpse into the Army's experience voting at the front. So let me make one thing clear about the Army's voting totals, and you can find them all in my book listed in a couple of appendices. The old Army of the Potomac, the Army of the Potomac that had enlisted in 1861, fought through 1862, 63, and early 1864, was dead and gone over the 6 weeks of the Overland Campaign in May and June. In other words, the Army of the Potomac that voted in 1864 in November was not the same Army of the Potomac that McClellan had commanded earlier in the war. The original 1861 recruits had been killed or wounded, discharged from illness, or often chose not to re-enlist because their bodies simply couldn't take it anymore. Thousands of replacements, reinforcements, draftees, and substitutes flooded the Army even before Grant's campaign was beginning, but the Army's transformation continued through its death struggle with Lee that spring. In spite of all of this, Lincoln still won the Army of the Potomac vote by an overwhelming margin as the ranks assembled to vote on the morning of November 8th at Petersburg. Tracking down the Army's voting tabulations was really exciting. Officers and men often kept very meticulous records of their tallies and published them or otherwise recorded them for posterity. Soldiers at the front voted using party ballots delivered by state-sanctioned agents sent from the governor and with the permission of the Secretary of War. Not all states allowed their men to vote at the front still, and some, such as New York, made it harder than some soldiers would have liked. Nonetheless, the election actually passed off with relatively little controversy in the camp. And so what you see on the screen here is a list of those regiments in the Army of the Potomac that voted for their old commander. That is to say, gave a majority to George McClellan. I will say there is a great deal of correlation between regiments with high McClellan vote totals and large numbers of conscripts and recruits. There's some anecdotal evidence to support the idea that those men may have been the staunchest McClellan supporters in the Army. Not the only McClellan supporters by any means, but maybe the most numerous. And then here you see the vast majority of regiments in the Army of the Potomac that cast their votes for Lincoln and the National Union Party. Of approximately 164 regimental voting totals that I found, 130 went for the administration. 71 regiments out of that 164 gave Lincoln more than 3/4 of their vote. And even more telling was how the Army of the Potomac vote compared with the vote tally on the home front. And so you see here, soldiers from every state but one gave Lincoln a solid majority of votes. Most states gave the National Union ticket at least a 15 to 20% higher vote percentage than the civilian vote in their home states did. The reality is that the Army of the Potomac, the very same field army that had once been George McClellan's, that had once loved George McClellan, and that had even once threatened to raise its voice against the administration over George McClellan's removal, rebuffed McClellan's Democratic Party and arguably helped win the war as much by voting as by fighting against the rebellion. What the Army of the Potomac won through its share of the vote and its share of the fighting was a Union restored, however imperfect, and a system of chattel slavery destroyed with treason's surrender. From my perspective, the most articulate writer and political thinker in the Army was James C. Rice, who you'll recall hearing about at the beginning of this presentation. He wrote to Lincoln words of encouragement in the war's darkest hour in early 1863. Upon assuming command of the 44th New York, he wrote, "I believe that it's God's divine purpose, having used the wrath of the South to commence this war, to cause that wrath, to praise him by the freedom of every slave. And I also confidently believe that this war, under his providence, will be made just severe enough to effect this object, and that it will be ended by God only when we, as individuals, both North and South, shall see and realize this divine object. Be assured that in this war there is a divinity that shapes our ends, rough hew them as we will. Rice gave his life attacking Confederate lines at Spotsylvania on May 10th, 1864. So with that, I thank you for your time and your attention over Zoom this evening. I'll be happy to take any questions you've got.